It is the silent crisis, quietly breaking the American dream.
Did you spend your entire life working, saving, and playing by the rules, only to watch your retirement security completely slip away? For our generation, the foundational math of the United States economy was simple and reliable. Work hard, manage your budget, and you'll have a comfortable, peaceful retirement. But in 2026, a dark and silent crisis is sweeping across the nation. The average person in America is running out of money, and the mainstream news is desperately trying to hide it.
Once full-time work stops covering the baseline, the crisis doesn't pause, it multiplies. Because the pressure isn't coming from one direction, it's coming from everywhere at once. The modern American economy hasn't just become expensive, it has redefined what expensive means. Survival itself has been repriced. Start with food. The average household that spent around $6,000 a year on groceries just a few years ago is now pushing closer to $8,500 or more, depending on location. That's not indulgence, that's basic consumption. Staples like eggs, meat, dairy, and produce have all seen aggressive price swings, with some categories jumping 30%, 40%, even 60% at peak periods. This isn't inflation in theory, it's a forced downgrade in real time. People aren't buying less because they want to. They're buying less because they have to. Then come utilities, once predictable, now volatile. In many regions, electricity bills that averaged $120 to $150 a month have surged to $300, $500, even $800 during peak seasons. Natural gas prices have followed the same trajectory, with winter heating costs becoming a financial shock instead of a routine expense. And unlike discretionary spending, these aren't optional. You either pay or you lose access. Transportation delivers another blow. The average annual cost of owning a vehicle in the US has crossed $10,000 when factoring in payments, insurance, fuel, and maintenance. Insurance premiums alone have jumped double digits in multiple states within a single year. Fuel fluctuates, repairs spike, and suddenly mobility, something once taken for granted, becomes a calculated risk. Healthcare tightens the vice even further. Premiums continue to rise, deductibles remain high, and out-of-pocket costs have turned routine care into delayed decisions. A single unexpected medical bill can now erase months of financial stability. Not because of mismanagement, but because the system demands it. And this is where the escalation becomes undeniable. Because when food, energy, mobility, and healthcare all rise together, they don't just strain budgets, they dismantle them. There's no category left to cut without consequence, no buffer left to absorb the impact. Once the cost of simply staying alive consumes nearly everything, the final pressure point isn't optional, it's structural. Shelter. The one expense that cannot be delayed, reduced, or negotiated away. This is where the entire system stops bending and starts breaking. For decades, housing functioned as a ladder. You started small, you moved up, and over time, stability turned into ownership. That ladder is now fractured. In its place is a barrier, one that gets higher the harder you try to climb it. The median home price in the United States has surged past $420,000. At current interest rates hovering between 6.5% and 7.5%, that translates into monthly payments exceeding $2,800 to $3,200 for a standard mortgage. That's before property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and repairs, all of which are rising simultaneously. Even entering the market has become mathematically impossible for many. A traditional 20% down payment on a $420,000 home requires $84,000 in cash. Not savings over time, cash up front. Meanwhile, first-time buyers are competing in markets where investors, private equity firms, and cash-rich buyers can outbid them instantly. The result isn't just difficulty, it's exclusion. But renting doesn't offer relief. It locks people into a different version of the same trap. The national average rent has climbed above $1,700, while in major metro areas, $2,500 to $3,500 is now common for basic units. And unlike ownership, that money builds nothing. It disappears monthly while renewal increases quietly reset the baseline higher each year. A renter isn't just paying for space. They're financing someone else's asset while losing their own ability to ever escape. Then come the hidden layers. Insurance premiums rising 20% to 40% in some regions. Property taxes increasing year after year. HOA fees climbing unpredictably, sometimes adding hundreds per month. Maintenance costs that never stop. Each layer compounds the total burden until even those who made it in realize they didn't escape the system. They just entered a more expensive version of it. This is where the shift becomes undeniable. Housing is no longer a foundation, it's a choke point. It doesn't stabilize your life, it dictates it. And when the largest expense in your life becomes uncontrollable, everything else begins to collapse around it. When shelter stops acting as a foundation, the damage doesn't stay confined to budgets. It reshapes the timeline of an entire generation. Because without stable housing, the traditional path into adulthood doesn't just slow down, it stalls. Millennials and Gen Z were handed a clear formula: education first, career next, stability after. On paper, they followed it. College enrollment surged. Degrees became the minimum requirement for entry-level roles. Yet the financial return on that investment has deteriorated. The average student loan balance now sits around $30,000 to $40,000, with many carrying far more. At the same time, entry-level salaries in many fields remain anchored between $45,000 and $60,000 annually. After taxes, that often translates to roughly $3,000 to $3,800 a month, an income bracket already outpaced by the realities established earlier. This is where the contradiction becomes unavoidable. The system demanded higher qualifications but failed to deliver proportional outcomes. Instead of accelerating independence, it delayed it. The median age of first-time homebuyers has climbed to nearly 36 years old, the highest on record. Marriage rates have declined. Birth rates have dropped to historic lows. These are not lifestyle choices in isolation. They are economic consequences. The result is what many have begun to call permanent adolescence. Not immaturity, not irresponsibility, but a forced extension of dependency. Living with parents longer, postponing milestones, reconsidering long-term plans not because of fear, but because of financial impossibility. The gap between effort and reward has widened to the point where even disciplined behavior no longer guarantees forward movement. And this is where the emotional fracture deepens, because when a generation does what it was told, studies, works, sacrifices, and still cannot secure the basics of independence, the issue is no longer personal. It becomes systemic. The promise that once defined progress has been quietly withdrawn. When a generation is locked out of ownership, delayed from independence, and pressed by costs it cannot outrun, the system doesn't collapse immediately. It adapts. It introduces a substitute: debt. Not as a backup plan, but as a primary mechanism to keep everything appearing functional. This is where the illusion begins. Because on the surface, life continues. People still drive newer cars, still furnish apartments, still travel, still consume. But underneath that continuity is a financial structure held together by borrowed time. Total U.S. consumer debt has now exceeded $17 trillion. Credit card balances alone have crossed $1.2 trillion, with average interest rates climbing past 20%. That is not sustainable liquidity. It is expensive survival. The role of credit has fundamentally changed. It was once a tool for leverage, used sparingly to bridge temporary gaps or invest in long-term growth. Now it has become a lifeline. Groceries go on cards. Utility bills get deferred. Medical expenses are split into installments. Everyday transactions are increasingly financed, not because people lack discipline, but because income no longer aligns with reality. Then comes the expansion of modern debt systems. Buy now, pay later services have surged into the mainstream. turning even small purchases into structured obligations. A $200 expense becomes 4 payments. A $1,000 purchase becomes a monthly burden. It feels manageable in the moment, but multiplied across dozens of transactions, it creates a silent accumulation of pressure that doesn't show up all at once. And this is how the system sustains the appearance of stability. Debt absorbs the difference between what people earn and what life costs. It delays the visible consequences. It allows consumption to continue even when the foundation is deteriorating. But that delay comes with a cost: interest, compounding balances, rising minimum payments, and eventually default. The most dangerous part isn't the existence of debt, it's the normalization of it. When borrowing becomes routine for basic living, the line between stability and collapse disappears. Everything looks intact until it isn't. Once the illusion of stability begins to fracture, the consequences don't stay hidden in statements or balances. They become visible in the most undeniable way possible. Shelter is lost, not in theory, not as a distant risk, but in real, measurable numbers that are rising faster than most people realize. Homelessness in the United States has surged past 650,000 people on a single night count, the highest recorded level in modern history. But that number only captures what is visible. Behind it exists a much larger, quieter reality. People living in cars, extended stay motels, overcrowded apartments, temporary arrangements that collapse without warning. This is not the fringe. This is the workforce. Because the most destabilizing shift isn't just that homelessness is increasing, it's who it's happening to. A growing percentage of those without stable housing are employed. They are clocking in, earning wages, contributing labor, and still unable to secure the most basic necessity. In some urban areas, over 40% of unhoused individuals report active employment. That statistic alone dismantles the old assumption that work guarantees survival. The reason is structural instability. Jobs have become fragmented. Hours fluctuate. Benefits are restricted. Employers cap workers below thresholds to avoid providing healthcare or paid leave. A person scheduled for 40 hours one week may drop to 25 the next. Not because demand disappeared, but because predictability has been removed from the equation. Income is no longer consistent enough to anchor long-term obligations like rent. And when rent alone consumes 50% to 70% of income in many cities, there is no room for disruption. One missed paycheck, one unexpected expense, one reduction in hours. That's all it takes to trigger displacement. There is no cushion left to absorb impact. This is where the middle class begins to disappear, not through sudden collapse, but through gradual erosion. People don't fall all at once. They slide, from stability to strain, from strain to vulnerability, from vulnerability to instability, until the line between getting by and losing everything becomes dangerously thin. The damage doesn't stop at income, housing, or debt. It moves into something far more dangerous: belief. Because every economy runs on an invisible engine. Not just money, but trust. Trust that effort leads somewhere. Trust that sacrifice has a payoff. Trust that tomorrow improves if you do the right things today. That engine is now failing. For decades, the formula was clear. Work harder, move forward. That expectation shaped entire generations. But today, that connection has been severed. People are putting in the hours, meeting expectations, staying disciplined, and seeing no meaningful change in their position. The result is not frustration alone, it is disorientation. Because when effort stops producing progress, the system stops making sense. The numbers reflect this shift. Nearly 60% of Americans now report living paycheck to paycheck. Over 70% say they feel constant financial stress. But those figures only capture the surface. Beneath them is a deeper shift in behavior. Saving loses its logic when goals keep moving out of reach. Long-term planning feels disconnected from reality when short-term survival consumes everything. Discipline doesn't disappear, it gets overridden. This is where the breakdown accelerates. People begin to pull back. Career ambition softens. Risk-taking declines. Major life decisions, marriage, children, relocation, investment, get pushed further into the future, sometimes indefinitely. At the same time, another pattern emerges. Some stop resisting altogether. Spending increases in bursts. Debt grows without hesitation. Not out of ignorance, but out of resignation. If the future feels inaccessible, the present becomes the only thing left to optimize. That shift carries consequences far beyond individual choices. Productivity weakens, innovation slows, social trust erodes. A workforce that no longer believes in upward movement doesn't collapse loudly. It disengages quietly, and that quiet disengagement spreads faster than any economic indicator can track. This is where the crisis reaches its most critical stage, because once belief is gone, recovery becomes exponentially harder. Not because resources are absent, but because participation begins to fade. That growing loss of belief doesn't exist in isolation. It points to something larger, something structural. Because what's breaking is not just individual stability. It's the agreement that once defined the entire system. For decades, the United States operated on an unspoken deal. Endure the pressure, play by the rules, and in return, you gain access to a better life over time. It was never perfect, but it was functional. That deal is now unraveling. The evidence is no longer subtle. Household debt has surged past $17 trillion. Credit card delinquencies are rising at the fastest pace in over a decade. Auto loan defaults are climbing. Savings rates, which once hovered near 8 to 10%, have dropped below 4% in recent periods. These are not isolated indicators. They are signals of a system extracting more than it returns. And when extraction exceeds growth for long enough, the structure begins to cannibalize itself. This is where the consequences expand beyond finances. A country that prices out its own people doesn't just create hardship, it creates distortion. Families delay or abandon long-term commitments because the numbers no longer justify the risk. Birth rates fall, not from choice alone, but from economic constraint. In fact, the U.S. fertility rate has dropped below 1.7 births per woman, well under the replacement level of 2.1. That is not a cultural shift. It is a financial signal. When the cost of raising a child exceeds $300,000 over 18 years, the decision becomes economic before it becomes personal. At the same time, geographic mobility, the ability to move for opportunity, has weakened. High housing costs and regional price disparities trap workers in place. The labor market becomes less dynamic, not because jobs disappear entirely, but because people can no longer afford to reposition themselves. Opportunity still exists, but access to it becomes restricted by cost barriers that didn't exist at this scale before. Then comes the concentration effect. Wealth accumulates at the top while pressure intensifies below. The top 10% of households now control roughly 70% of total U.S. wealth, while the bottom 50% hold less than 3%. That imbalance is not just inequality, it's instability, because an economy cannot sustain long-term growth when the majority of its population is financially constrained. Consumption weakens, risk tolerance declines, innovation slows. The system begins to rely on fewer and fewer participants to drive momentum. And yet, from the outside, everything still appears intact. Markets reach record highs. Corporations report strong earnings. New developments rise across city skylines. But this is where the disconnect becomes dangerous. Because those signals no longer reflect the condition of the average person. They reflect the performance of capital, not the health of the population. The gap between those two realities is widening, and inside that gap, pressure builds. This is how systemic failure develops, not through sudden collapse, but through prolonged imbalance. The majority continues to function, but with reduced capacity, increased stress, and shrinking margins. Over time, that strain translates into broader consequences. Declining trust in institutions, rising political volatility, social fragmentation, and a growing sense that the system is no longer aligned with the people sustaining it. And once that alignment breaks, recovery becomes exponentially more difficult. Not because solutions don't exist, but because the foundation required to implement them, public trust, participation, belief, has already eroded. A system can absorb shocks. It can adapt to change. but it cannot survive indefinitely while pushing its own population to the edge of viability. Because in the end, this is what it comes down to. A country is not defined by its stock market, its corporations, or its global influence. It is defined by whether the average person can live, work, and build a future within it. And right now, that foundation is cracking, quietly, systematically, irreversibly. The bills are rising faster than incomes. The margins are disappearing. The pressure is compounding. And when a nation reaches the point where millions of people are no longer chasing a better life, but simply trying to avoid falling apart, that is no longer an economy under stress. That is an economy running out of time.